Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Miebert, and I am a founding member of LitX, an educational cohort that plans pop culture centric programming for conventions and conferences across the country. What you will be watching is our second video in a series in conjunction with New York Comic Con's Metaverse event. The panel that you will be watching is Graphic Novels Are Elementary, getting the most from graphic novels in your K-6 teaching. This is a great panel of both educators and educational professionals who discuss how they have brought comics into their classroom and how you can do the same. So by all means, sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'll see you on the other side.
Hello, my name is Betsy Gomez, and today I'm moderating Graphic Novels Are Elementary, getting the most from graphic novels in your K-6 teaching. What are comics and graphic novels? Which titles should I choose for my classroom? How do comics help students learn? How do I teach with graphic novels? In this panel, you'll learn about the power of comics and graphic novels as teaching and learning tools and how to share that power with others, not just your students, but also your colleagues, administrators, and parents. This panel is courtesy of the educational cohort LitX, a collective working to help educators teach with all forms of 21st century media, music, film, games, comics, and so much more. By teachers for teachers, you can find LitX on Twitter at WeAreLitX. With that, I would like to open it up to our panelists and ask you guys to introduce yourselves. Dana, do you want to kick us off?
I might as well. Hi, I'm Dana Simpson. I do the syndicated comic strip and also book and graphic novel series Phoebe and Her Unicorn. This is the new one. It comes out in September. I also used to do a webcomic called Ozzy and Millie, and I guess my qualification for being here is that I often speak in schools and most of my fans are under 13.
Thank you, Dana. Tony, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Tony Weaver Jr. I'm an author and an educator. I write a comic called The Uncommons that can be read on Webtoon, or we just released our print edition. I'm also the author of the upcoming graphic novel From First Second, Weirdo, releasing in winter 2022, which feels so far away, but it's creeping up on us gradually. I'm also the founder of an organization called Weird Enough Productions. We're a nonprofit that uses superheroes and comics for literacy and social emotional learning in schools around the country.
Great, thanks, Tony. Ben, it's your turn to be in the hot seat.
Yeah, happy to be here. It's so great to see all you guys. My name is Ben Packard, and I'm a second grade general education teacher in the south suburbs of Chicago. I've had the privilege of sitting on panels at C2E2 and Denver Pop Culture Con about integrating comics into the elementary curriculum. So I'm really happy to be here with you guys today.
Thanks, Ben. Jana?
My name is Jana Tropper. I'm a speech and language pathologist in a preschool through 5th grade elementary school in North Aurora, Illinois. I work with the self-contained classrooms in the social communication program.
All right, thank you. And last but not least, LT.
Hello, everyone. Hailing from California. My name is Lawrence Tan, also known as LT. I am an upper grade elementary teaching 4th and 5th currently in Oakland, California, but I've had many years of teaching in Watts, South Central Los Angeles. And I've been using comic books in the classroom for many years, especially with that ethnic studies lens and critical conscious building. So I'll share some of that today.
Great. Thank you, LT. All right, let's get into the meat of this. Let's talk about why comics. What is the power of the medium? Creators, I'd like to have you guys talk about why you chose to create comics as opposed to other forms of media.
Me?
Yeah, go for it, Dana.
Well, for me, it's just sort of a combination of everything that I enjoy doing. Like, I wanted to make comics from the time I was really young because I like to draw and I like to write and I don't like group projects. And so I liked the idea. I like to read comics and think one person is responsible for this entire vision, and they got to say whatever they wanted to say. It's like a movie that one person gets to make, and I was always fascinated by that. and I started making I started trying to make comics myself when drew my first one when I was 5. And I feel a connection now when I hear people say, and people say this to me a lot, people say, you know, my kid wasn't much of a reader, but then they started reading your stuff and or graphic novels generally, and that really drew them into reading. And sometimes they move on from there to reading other stuff, and sometimes they're just a graphic novel person. But you know, I was that kind of kid too. I wanted to make comics and I wanted to read comics.
All right, great. Thanks, Dana. Tony, what drew you to comics?
I think that I've always been intrigued about the power that sequential art has above other mediums in order to communicate stories that feel immersive in a very accessible way. So generally, if you want to go fully immersive, someone might think of VR. And my first thought is, well, how many people do you know that actually have a VR headset at home? Like I don't know many of them. And when you think of films as well, films have the potential to be immersive, but it is very much up to the vision of the director. You are literally being shown what the director wants you to see at all times. Whereas in a comic, there's this magical thing that happens where as an author, I can write and work with the illustrators on my team to create these immersive worlds. And readers will not only get what I'm trying to show them, but they get their own personal experience as well based on where their eye drifts. If you show somebody a picture of this sweeping cityscape, as an author, I want to invite you into the city. And as a reader, you'll go, okay, this is a city. But if I were to ask each of you what part of the city that you recognize first, someone may say, well, I noticed that the skyscrapers are really tall and I grew up in New York, so I always like a good skyscraper. Or someone may say, I'm not from a major city. I grew up in the country, so I was looking for the nature and I noticed there's a pond in this park over here and I really like this part. So there's something about the ability of sequential art to bring people together in order to experience a story, but also allow them to experience it in their own way that I think is really powerful for introducing people into a new story.
Great, thank you. All right, so for the educators on the panel, why do you choose to use comics and graphic novels in your classrooms? And how do you respond when people tell you that they don't think that comics are real reading?
So kind of piggybacking off of what Tony just said regarding the sequential art, I feel as though, you know, comics provide such a unique and special blend of writing and illustration. So comics are just generally aesthetically pleasing to the eyes. They're like a visual feast, and kids nowadays, more so than ever, it seems, are visual learners. So I think that we are kind of in a prime position here to be using more comics in the classroom. And then kind of to Dana's point, I also grew up a struggling reader. I hated reading. And when my parents, you know, asked my teacher how to change this, she basically said, find something he likes, find a book about it, and read at home. You know, it was at that point that my dad brought up his 6 giant boxes of comics from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, his childhood collection. And I just, you know, devoured them. And that's where my love of reading comes from. And so when people kind of try to tell me that comics aren't real reading, and they have, I've heard parents and other teachers tell me this. I just kind of point to myself here and say that, you know, I'm that story.
I once got a 5-star review for one of my books on Amazon where the person wrote, "My kid loves these as an alternative to reading books," or something like that. And it was like, thank you for the 5 stars, but what? Like, I think there's that bias that like it doesn't count as real reading, but yes, it does.
I use graphic novels with my students, so because I'm a speech language pathologist, all my students by definition have communication disorders. And often, even if it's something like articulation or stuttering, it could also be language, and also that could be also students that have English as their second language and other components. So having something where they can use the pictures to support their answers, where they can get information from the pictures and have it work in concert with the decoding piece of it, breaks down barriers to show what they know. So they're not only working on formulating the words and the concepts and the ideas, transforming it into what they're going to say and hope it's understood. It kind of removes a couple of those pieces. I also run a 5th grade comic book club, which is after school, which is always fantastic. Got pretty easy buy-in, but I do hear things about comics not being real reading, and if there's words, it's reading. A cereal box is reading. I'm not going to have that fight with people. And it's interesting. I was actually looking at one of the unicorn books earlier, and on just the first couple pages, the words summon, distracted, transport, suspended, eternity, that's on the first 3 pages. Don't tell me that's not hard vocabulary. Don't tell me that's not academically rigorous. Don't tell me that the gutter is not the place of inference. You can do so much with these. And I think that something I say to people that, you know, just see it as just superheroes and just fun stuff is that it is a medium, it's not content. So you could have a very serious movie that's high art. You could also have, you know, garbage movies. We've been locked down for months. We all know what we're talking about. But that the separating the medium from the content helps get the conversation going with colleagues.
For me, it started with the fact that I used to read and collect, had aspirations of drawing my own comic books and writing my own stories. And just like that being the, you know, as I come in as a teacher, thinking like, okay, how do I genuinely connect to my youth? And the fact that, you know, with hip hop and comics and video games, like I can like bring that genuine youth culture into learning, which number one brings in the engagement piece. And then we can amp it up and tweak it into very high levels. And so if anyone asks about comic books, because of course, especially in the upper grades, 4th and 5th grade, some of the parents are like, they should be reading chapter books, no picture books at all. And then you see the level of work that we can produce, whether it's critically analyzing and writing about the protagonists, right? Or when students create their own comic books. And so it's always, in terms of anyone, in anything that I've done, you always CYA, you cover your ass by connecting the standards and showing products, not just we're reading comic books, but we're analyzing text, right? And we do that with videos and music and comic is a form. To be quite honest, in this day and age, in the TikTok era, in the YouTube generation, like kids are learning from media, you know, like visual media far faster than print text. And so to have a bridge and a transition where you can, you know, tie that all together, get the engagement, get the buy-in, and then offer other options, that is priceless. And once you have the buy-in, you can take off as a class, you can take off as a, you know, academically and whatnot. So just some, you know, major things. But I think it really boils down to the fact that we genuinely have something in common that we can dialogue and discuss and be in, you know, equal participants in the learning process.
Great, thank you. So Dana, I'm gonna have you kick us off on this one. Could you tell us a little bit about your comics and your creative process in making them?
First of all, as as we have seen, I don't dumb the vocabulary down. I don't think when I first started writing the strip that I was aware that I was writing for kids. Maurice Sendak said once, I write for myself and they tell me it's for children. Actually, I think he said that a lot. And that's always how it's been for me. Like when I started doing the strip, I had a development deal to do a syndicated comic strip. I didn't say I'm going to write something that'll be for kids. I just wanted them to launch it in the newspaper. And then when we did the first book, they said, we're going to make this as part of our comics for kids line. And I was like, oh, great, that makes sense. And so we did some editing of that first book. We removed some references that my editor didn't think kids would know. references to stuff like The Godfather and Bono that were funny to me, but wouldn't translate if you're 9 years old. Did you know kids don't know who Bono is? I have found that. I've asked a bunch of kids, none of them knows who Bono is. And that's kind of, even though I do kind of write with kids in mind, I'm still just writing for myself. I'm still just writing something I would want to read, and maybe more relevant, something that 10-year-old me would have wanted to read. And I approach it that way. Sometimes it's me working through stuff that's going on in my life now, or stuff that was going on in my life when I was a kid, and I'll just sort of put Phoebe in that situation and see what she does. And maybe that's why kids connect to it. It's just me, 9 years old, riding a unicorn to school and having adventures and dealing with things. I've had people say before that they approach writing very differently, that they write with particular ideas they want to communicate, or with a particular audience in mind when they start, and I'm just writing what I want to write. I'm glad that kids connect to it.
Yeah, thank you. Tony, can you tell us a little bit about your work and your creative process?
I think that something that's very influential on my writing process is that, so I write the Uncommons. So it's my original story. I work with a team of artists to illustrate it that are both extremely talented. But the Uncommons is also the root of majority of the programmatic work that my nonprofit organization does. So there's half of me that's creator about what do I want to write and what story do I want to tell. And there's another half of me that's organization leader that says, here's what we need you to talk about in order for me to go back to our funders and secure another check so that we can keep doing what we do. And most people illustrate this kind of battle between creative and higher up executive that's always tenuous. And I want to write about this. Well, that's not what's gonna sell. And I have that battle in my head. So it's me versus me, like, oh man, I would really like to write about this thing, but how is it going to play into this? How's it going to work into this? But I think that as a writer, what it's caused me to do is always challenge myself as a writer. So the thing that I hear very often is people say that they want to write what they wish they had when they were younger. And for me, as a Black kid that was really weird growing up in Atlanta, that didn't see a lot of characters that he felt like he could relate to at all, let alone characters that look like him. I agree with that 100%. I write what I needed when I was younger. But what adds a kind of layer to that is that when I was younger, most of the things that I liked were either really obscure, or if they were mainstream, they got canceled very shortly after they went on the air. So on paper, what I liked is what gets canceled. What if I write more of what I like? I have no reason to believe that in 2020 suddenly it is going to become a cult classic and become this ubiquitous cultural cornerstone, because the stuff that I liked and the subject matter that I like to explore was never something that the mainstream could explore. So as a writer, what I think about, what I believe is that there is no intellectual gap between the niche and the mainstream. That the only difference between the niche and the mainstream is that what was niche was unable to captivate people in a way that what was mainstream was. So as a writer, I think about how can I take these themes that are really compelling to me and make them compelling to everybody, which is challenging, but also really fun.
Great, thank you so much. So let's talk about actually using comics with kids and students. And I'm going to start with Jana on this. What does that look like for you? And can you take us through an example of a book that you use with your students and what that process looks like?
Let's try that again. So one that I really like using is these very early first graphic novels. And as I said before, you know, inference lives in the gutter. What are we going to do between this moment and that moment? What happened? What do we think happens? Predicting some of that higher level stuff, but with a very straightforward text. So for example, you know, this is about a boy who goes up into his attic to get something. And we talk about his facial expression. How do you think he feels to get the social emotional component? We talk about looking around. What do you see? And then what changes, you know, from panel to panel. And it's probably hard to see over Zoom, but you see a little part of a snake change positions throughout the panel as the story goes on. That's the big reveal at the end. Sorry, spoiler alert, is that there's a snake in the attic. And being able to have them look and provide evidence, which is consistent with a lot of the Common Core standards, which is helpful, gets them to, they state their case and then they provide the support for it. And then if they don't have the vocabulary, they can point, oh, to show me they notice it, I provide the vocabulary and model it, but I can tell that they got the concept of inferring. I need to work on the language, as opposed to students that can talk around the point all day, but really didn't get it, and they're just waiting for you to say, oh, okay, and go to the next kid. So it kind of helps suss out the ones that have gotten to be good fakers.
Thank you,
I'm
Ben.
offended. I can talk around the point all day. You said fakers, and my brain was like, oh no, they're on.
All right, Ben or LT, do you want to talk about your experience?
Yeah. You know, my belief is that comic book lessons don't have to be this big production. You know, I do like an initial week long lesson about how to read comic books, because, you know, the left to right, the panels, following the panels and everything like that. But after that, I really just try to integrate them here and there when they're appropriate. And I think educators will find out that they're very appropriate most of the time. So for example, like I try to start all of my guided reading groups with a short comic strip activity. So depending on what I'm working on with the kids, and, you know, teachers are, you know, expected to buy their own supplies and whatnot. So this is a nice, cheap, easy way to still integrate comics, but I just, you know, go online, or I go to the newspaper that morning, I'll cut out some paper, some comic strips. But, you know, I'll cut out Garfield, Peanuts, Calvin and Hobbes, thing like that. But if I'm ever covering like inferencing, for instance, then I might do something like, you know, I'll take the dialogue out of the speech bubbles, or, you know, have the students write it in just based on the visuals. Or I might have them fill in the gutter, which, you know, I was so happy to hear Jana talk a few minutes ago, because the gutter, you know, that space in between the panels, the gutter is gold. I mean, that's where a good chunk of the story and the imagination comes to light. But, you know, it doesn't have to be this big production, or it doesn't have to be a total overhaul of your curriculum. You know, educators would be, you know, amazed to see just how well comics and graphic novels actually fit into their curriculum, you know, if they just give it a chance.
We should collaborate on a panel called Get Your Mind in the Gutter.
I like that. I like that a
To
lot.
teach inference.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Put a pin in it.
All right, LT, can you tell us a little bit about your experience reading comics with your students?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I start with where they're at and everything. And so a lot of them already gravitate to the Marvel stuff because of the MCU. And, you know, we get into that. And, you know, I like to problematize some things. And some of the stuff that my students come up on their own, of like, why are the main heroes a certain body type? Why are they a certain, mostly, you know, male, or predominantly like white? And so things like that complicate the thing, and then you take it further. And so we start with where they're at. We might analyze some of the things that they're into, and nowadays kids are a lot of my kids are into manga, and we got into some of that. Boruto is still or Naruto and Boruto is still really high, and Pokemon making a comeback. And so, you know, kind of just getting them interested, and then as an educator, how do you take some of that and complicate it a little bit? And so, for example, you know, 4th grade, we do a little California history. I'm talking internment camps. We analyze some Dr. Seuss political cartoons, and talk about like the image of how Japanese were portrayed, and then how that led into the internment camps and the fear. And then we bring in, like, They Call Us Enemy, right? They Call Us Enemy, and we get some inserts, and we just kind of, you know, we talk about like perspective and different things, and go into a little depth and critical analysis on the things that, you know, with those comics. and just kind of, again, looking at it as a medium to where it's accessible to the students, and then you can ramp it up. And so I agree with Ben where it doesn't have to be like I do a full-blown unit on comic analysis and comic production, but even these little moments of like, here's a comic strip, let's analyze it, let's take it to the front, and then you develop those skills, and that is helpful for when my students make their comics, and decide to like be more inclusive of exactly what Tony was saying, that what their wants, where they're coming from, their backgrounds, and then and kind of speak back to some of the dominant narrative and create their own like counter narrative on that sense. And so those are just a little tidbits, but like everything else that everyone said, yes, the literacy analysis, the ELA stuff that's attached to it. But like I said, I also like to highlight the focus of the critical thinking, critical problem solving, the ethnic studies lens to comic book in education.
Great, thank you. So Tony and Dina, could you tell us about your experiences sharing your work during with kids or during classroom visits? What does that look like for you, and how do you share your work with younger readers?
I don't know. When I go into classrooms, it's sort of my presentation I do is sort of a combination where I do read some of the material for them and they enjoy that. Usually historically, I usually do like the first storyline where Phoebe and Marigold meet, because it's a standalone story and it's fun and they like it and I'm proud of it. But I also talk a lot about what making comics is like, what my life has been like up to that point. I usually do not go into the fact that I'm a transgender woman, although I have brought it up before, to sort of communicate to kids, anybody can go on and do anything they want to do. If people tell me like there's a trans kid at this school and that would mean something, I tend to bring it up. Other times I honestly am sick of talking about it. But and I feel like it's not necessary to understand the story, but I sort of communicate to kids that, my life is my education in comics. The reason that I'm successful at it is that I did it for years and never ever gave up. And here's aspects of my life that get into my work, like this character is based on my husband, this character is based on my sister, this character is based on me. And sort of maybe demystifying the art of making comics to kids a little bit. This is how I do it. This is what goes into it. You could do it.
I think that for me, I enter classroom visits as an opportunity to be of service to the young people that I get to talk to. So for me, do I want to talk about the uncommons? Yes, I'm always on to talk about the uncommons. But something that I took for granted that I had to learn when I went into classroom visits was how few students have had the opportunity to actually talk to an author before, but furthermore, how few Black students have had the opportunity to see a Black author. Like we were at the Schomburg Center for Arts and Culture in Harlem for the Black Comic Book Festival earlier this year, and a kid walks up to me. We have like this giant Uncommons poster. He says that he wants the book. His mom buys him the book. And he's no older than 8 years old. And his mom's like, do you want him to sign it? And he goes, why? And she goes, because he wrote it. It's his book. And the kid looks at me and he points at the book and he's like, you wrote this? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, how? this kind of connection of, I think young people are very smart, and even LT, listening to some of the things that you were saying about the competencies that you go over with your students blew my mind, because a lot of that stuff, I was like, man, I wish we could be open about the fact that fourth graders are able to comprehend and talk about these subjects. But even though they're very smart intellectually, there are still some lines that we have to draw in places where there is underrepresentation and places where there is misrepresentation. I think classroom visits are powerful just to be able to show, hey, this person looks like you. This person is a person just like you. And they have the capacity to create this thing that you enjoyed and that you admire. My favorite anime ever is Eureka 7, and I watched it because I got woken up by the ending of the Inuyasha theme song in the middle of the night at like 1 a.m. I fell asleep with the TV on, and I couldn't go back to sleep. This show came on. I had never experienced a show like this before, and at the end in the credits, when the words "written by" popped up, that was the thing that made me decide, oh, I want to do that. Because what I just watched is something that a person, it was in their head and then they made it, and now it's 1:30 in the morning and I'm wired and I wish that there was more. I want to have the ability to do that to people. So when I walk into classroom visits, what I try to do is make kids feel how I felt during that time when I realized, wait, somebody wrote this.
All right. Thank you so much, Tony. That's a really powerful statement. And I'm actually going to skip ahead in our script a little bit because that how and the idea of representation plays into this next question. How do both reading and creating comics support and extend students' social emotional competencies? How can using comics foster critical literacy and cultural competence? And I'm putting this to the entire panel, so whoever wants to step in first.
Since I work with a social communication program, that's something I'm always conscious of, especially when this year we went to remote learning, and it was especially hard think about how hard it was for neurotypical adults to have their schedule wrecked, their expectations changed. Now imagine that you're neurodiverse, that you're an autistic individual, and you're going to add a layer of, a pandemic on that. So a lot of my students were really out to sea. Something I used was the book I Am Peace, because it talks a lot about, I was like, something about to the effect of, sometimes this sadness is like an anchor dragging me down. So encouraging students to use that visual imagery, whether to draw it and talk about it, to talk about some really complex feelings, to get past that language piece. If they can't pull up the word, they can't pull up the word in English, they can do it in Spanish, but I took 2 years in high school. Like, only so much I can help, meet you with, but if you can show me a picture, draw me a picture, and tell me how that develops. If we can look at these images and their facial expression, can we predict what happens next? What can we infer about the size of the letters, about, if it's a small pop or a big pop? So being able to take all the clues and talk about how that could filter into an emotion, how you can make it concrete, taking all these little pieces, because sometimes it's so hard to string it together, especially little kids with big feelings. So adding the picture piece in there, adding some of that metaphorical language is just unbelievably helpful.
I think that comics have an unprecedented ability to impact the way that a person sees themselves, how they see the world, and how they see others. And when it comes to how comics impact a person's social emotional wellness, I think that what we see is an extension of that power. So being able to read a story of a character that has similar experiences to you, number one, validates you because you realize, okay, I'm not crazy. I'm not the only person that's experiencing this in some capacity. But also watching that character overcome that obstacle can make you think, wow, I can do it. I can come up with my own solution because this character is able to come up to a solution. Or even watching that character fail can help you realize, well, I'm not going to try that one because that didn't work out for them. So I'm not going to try that piece. But I think that something really powerful happens when we think about how comics and sequential art, specifically as a medium, is able to help us understand others, because I bring it up a lot because it's integral to my experience. But as a Black man, what I have to carry a lot is that when I go to certain parts of the country or certain parts of the world, especially when I'm talking to students, there are some young people that have not spent a significant amount of time with somebody that is of a race different than theirs before. And it's not because somebody did anything wrong or because they purposely made a decision not to do that. They just haven't had that experience. But with comics, if we're demonstrating diverse characters, culturally accessible characters, and culturally relevant characters, if I get that in your hands when you're young, before a lot of those biases have the opportunity to take hold, then maybe when you do run into a person that's different than you, you'll know how to act. Maybe when you do run into a person that's different than you, you'll already at least have some of the context and cultural competency required to be kind, to respect that person. And I don't think that's just a racial thing. I think that's when you encounter somebody and you know to ask for their pronouns before you assume whatever you're supposed to call them, so that you know when people come from a certain culture, what's respectful and what isn't. I think that has a large impact on social emotional wellness, not only for the individual student, but the social emotional wellness of the people that they will inevitably run into.
Um, for me growing up, like the X-Men resonated for a lot of folks because of the way it kind of represented different things for different people and the band of misfits and whatnot. But I teach in Watts, East Oakland, and what's really prevalent in our timelines has been the Emmett Tills, right? The Trayvon Martin, the Oscar Grants, George Floyd right now, and even more, and like these are on the tips of my students' tongues all the time. And so even something like being able to use excerpts from I Am Alfonso Jones to help them process and dialogue and get through some of the narrative, and then kind of make these connections, right? And then even just like how Emmett Till, comparing and contrasting Emmett Till with Trayvon Martin, and just like how that spurred on the Black Lives Matter movement, how that spurred on the civil rights movement, right? And so like using these kind of connective, mediums to be able to bring out some of the discussion, the dialogue, and and to be able to build on that, like that can be very powerful. And you open up a space that your students can entertain and participate in a safe way. And these are things that they can resonate, because this is what they see like frequently, unfortunately, right? And like, how do we deal with that? And then that fuels them to kind of, even when they create their own comic books and their own ways of expressing what their problems and solutions and community issues, it becomes very powerful.
I think
Yeah,
it's strange. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, please go ahead, please.
Oh, I was going to say, I think it's strange sometimes how little LGBTQ specific content I've ever created and put out into the world, considering who I am in my own life. It hasn't really been where I've felt like going. Like, I don't necessarily want to write stories about how hard it is, although I'm working on, I am writing a graphic novel memoir at the moment that's entirely about that. And we'll see how that's received when it gets into kids' hands. But I mean, most of what I've created up to now is sort of me getting beyond that. And I sort of feel like my role in terms of expanding students' understanding of the world is sort of just to be who I am and be there. I know there's schools that have not been comfortable having me because you can't put a scary trans person in front of children. I mean, I've spoken at a lot of schools too. I'm not aware of having been rejected a lot of times over that, but I know it's happened. And I know there's been some parental complaints about my presence there, and sometimes I think I should be making more content that addresses this. I was just thinking as y'all were talking about how I wish when I was that age that there had been content involving LGBT characters like at all. And I know it exists now, but I also feel like a lot of what exists is kind of in one area. A lot of it is kind of in this area of dealing with sort of the struggle to be understood. I illustrated a book that's about that recently. I wish more than anything that what had been in front of me when I was that age had been LGBT people that were actually like how I felt inside, just existing and living their lives and being in stories for no other reason than people get to be in stories. More of that, please. If anybody out there in a position to create that sort of content is watching, please make that and give it to children so that the me's of the next generation can see themselves in comics.
Well, it's about normalizing as opposed to othering, and we need more normalization.
Yeah, and frankly, I'm just sort of tired of every trans character in anything being tragic.
All right, thank you.
I think kids getting to see that it can just be normal and you can just live your life and just be yourself is important. And I try to do some of that.
Thank you. Ben, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add really quickly. I mean, I have a calm down corner in my classroom, appropriate called the Fortress of Solitude, where students can go, if they're feeling overwhelmed. And along with the calm down box, I have kind of short comics, as well as like images to kind of help them understand that their thoughts and their feelings, their emotions are in fact valid. And thankfully, there's such a push nowadays for SEL, social emotional learning in the classroom. And that's coming in tandem, with a time where there's such diversity with comic creators, and their voices are now being amplified. So it's great to see that, if you are having a problem, there's more than likely a story out there that was kind of written for you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to skip ahead one more time. Before we wrap up, and I ask you guys to give us a plug for titles that you and your students love and your projects, do you have any tips or suggestions for selecting and acquiring comics and graphic novels for the classroom? Teachers and librarians are always looking for resources. So what are your go-tos?
Is this just for the educators, or can the creators hop into?
Oh yeah, hop in. If you know something, hop in.
My challenge is something that's not from a publisher you've heard of before. Once everything's back to normal and we retain some sense of normalcy, go to your local comic or anime convention, walk down Artist Alley, and purchase a zine, purchase a graphic novel that the artists themselves made and printed. Of course, ask them if it's age appropriate, and of course you have to read it, but buy one of those and tell your friends about it. Those are the resources I recommend. I think local artists, as well as independent artists, are making such amazing work right now. Even if you look at Webtoon hosts over 1.3 million creator-owned comic series that are all on an app and free to read. And in an era of e-learning, of virtual learning, whatever you want to call it, where teachers are like, okay, I need you to read this, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this resource into your hands. Having something on Webtoon where you can literally just go and pull it up and they're going to have free access to it, I think that's invaluable.
I was going to talk about webcomics, but you covered it, so thanks.
Well, so one thing I would add actually is that comic book retailers are an amazing resource, not just for books that might be good for the classroom, but also, developing a relationship with your comic book retailers. It's also a good way to find creators who might come in for classroom visits, a good way to find new titles that you may not know about. Retailers know the content better than pretty much anybody out there. And so developing a partnership with your local comic book retailer, I highly suggest that. Some retailers are better than others, obviously, but retailers are so enthusiastic and know so much. They're pretty invaluable.
I find the students also to be a great resource, what they're reading, what they want, what they saw their friend with on the bus. If they're talking about Amulet and you only have one copy, 10 kids want Amulet. Like, by the time it gets mentioned to you, it's already exploding in popularity. So asking what they want, seeing if they want other things by the same author, and just letting them, check out previews of different things, like when there's online sneak peeks, see if they're interested. But they're not shy about recommendations if you open the door.
Yes, all of that. Local comic book retailers, definitely. Local library is definitely also a good spot to start, especially because you don't have to pay for anything. You can check it out. Free comic book day, it's been happening. Always pick up as much as I can, and because I have a connection with the local retailer, any extras I get for my classroom, obviously you have to peruse it. and that what everyone else said. But I think I've been also perusing and really looking into a lot of the Kickstarters and Indiegogos to kind of see who can I support, what looks culturally responsive and community responsive for those I serve. But you just keep looking, and then yes, of course, always what are the students into, and then start from there and have some jump off points.
Great. All right. So last question. Let's make it quick. Tell us about what you're working on, what you've got coming out soon, and if you don't have anything for the general public, tell us about a comic that you and your students particularly love.
I've got something to pitch, or like a pitch, plug. Gotta get my words right. This comes out tomorrow. It is called I'm Not a Girl. It's a picture book for younger kids. I'm the illustrator. The author is a young man who is a remarkable young trans boy who wrote this book about his attempts to be understood. It has a happy ending. I think it's a great resource for kids trying to understand themselves or trying to understand their friends. I hope it gets into a lot of small hands.
Oh, Tony, you're muted.
Darn, I did the thing. Okay. Obviously, read the Uncommon. You can purchase our print edition at shop.weirdenough.com, or you can check us out on Webtoon. We love Webtoon. We just broke like over 500,000 readers on Webtoon, which is ridiculous. So definitely check us out there. Weirdo, being published by First Second, coming out in January 2022. Obviously, more on that as we get closer. I would also highly recommend, there's a Kickstarter going on right now for an anthology series called Mañana, Latinx comics from the 25th century. It's an anthology kind of sci-fi comic set 1,000 years after the birth of Latin America. I backed it on day one, and I am so eager. Like, I can't wait. I'm really excited. There are dozens of artists working on it, all of whom I respect and really love their work. I think it's going to be really cool.
So really quickly, JL8, it's a free webcomic, short 3 to 6 panel strips about the Justice League if they were 8 years old. Works perfectly with my 8-year-olds. I use these for my initial comic book lessons, and then I also use them with guided reading as well. I also use How-Toons. It's called Tools of Mass Construction, so with a big push for STEAM in the classroom. And in schools, this is perfect for learning, creating, crafting, and I highly recommend it.
I use just about everything from classic Spider-Man to Ultimate Spider-Man to, things like, Clues in the Attic or, Unicorn in Many Hats. I am gearing myself up. I'd really like to introduce The Arrival. It's the only one that teachers get to say it's not reading because there are no words. But I do find it to be something that can inspire a lot of discussion. And to hop back briefly, Kickstarter is a phenomenal way to find diverse comics. That's how I got Tuskegee Airs. That's how I got Cuentos, which should be coming. A lot of different barriers that are in traditional publishing don't exist in crowdfunding. So they can just skip the system and what's been set up and kind of go straight to the masses. And there are markets. These things are getting funded. They're getting in hands. And I think that the momentum is building.
I'm into a lot of things, and my brain's always working, so I'm doing a lot of unit building, curriculum design, and people have always been asking me about that. And if folks hit me up on the contact feeds that are following, I will share curriculum. Otherwise, I'm working on putting it up on Teachers Pay Teachers, semi-selling out. But if you hit me up personally, I will share curriculum and start conversations so we can build a movement of not only comic, critical analysis and comic development, but even the STEAM stuff and with all that stuff. So yeah.
All right, great. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Dana, Tony, Jana, Ben, and LT for being amazing creators and educators, and for making it possible to use comics with kids. And thank you also to LitX for bringing us together today. I hope you'll have a great one.
All right. Thank you again for watching our LitX panel in conjunction with New York Comic Con's Metaverse. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking that subscribe button below. Also, be sure to follow us on Twitter at WeAreLitX. But until next time, everyone, take care.